Welcome back to All In Driving. This video is the third in my series to get you ready for the 2024 Formula One season. Now, I am a week behind. Bahrain already happened, but I want to make sure I put out a good video instead of rushing it to get it out for you. So if you want to see my predictions from those first two videos, you can take a look at those here. I've got the drivers and constructors predictions for this year. But if you have no idea what's going on, if maybe you've seen a couple episodes of Drive to Survive, but you want to watch races live as they happen, then this video is for you. To keep it digestible, I won't go too deep into any one subject, but I will try to touch on everything. So let's get into it. We'll start with a brief history of Formula One, which formed in the mid-1940s when the FIA, the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, homologated rules from Grand Prix races that had been going on for a couple decades at that point. The original cars had long front ends with straight 8-cylinder engines. The drivers nearly sat in line with the rear wheels. These are the guys that you see cruising around in the goggles and the leather hats, with the wind in their faces going 100 miles an hour. The first championship of drivers was held in 1950 and featured versions of tracks that are still parts of the series today. Those being Silverstone, Spa, Monza, and Monaco. There were only 7 races in that championship, and the first ever Formula One champion was Italian Nino Farina, driving an Alfa Romeo. The first Manufacturers' Cup came later in 1958 and was won by Vanwall. What, you don't know who Vanwall is? Me either. So how about Lotus, who won in 59 and 60? Not really a car fan, no? Don't know them either? Okay, well, how about Ferrari? Ferrari's first win was in 1961, and altogether they've won 16 Constructors' Titles Championships, the most of any team out there. Eventually, engines moved to the rear, got a lot bigger. Turbos were added for a while before the FIA banned them. Engines then started to get smaller again, and now they've brought back turbos and have hybrid 1.6-liter engines. Aerodynamics and downforce became a focus throughout the 60s and 70s and continue to be one of the main focuses on teams now. Safety, which had been an afterthought originally, was fortunately given more and more importance. And today, these cars are almost as safe as they can be for basically being rocket ships. Recently, cost caps and limits on testing time have tried to make competition closer between the teams. For a quick reference, here are the top 5 winningest teams and drivers since the inception of Formula One. There's so much history, and you should definitely check out more, but for now, we need to move on. Teams spend a lot of money and a lot of time getting ready for the Formula One season. Each team has a max budget of around $140 million to spend on building and developing their race cars. However, that does not include some of the biggest costs that they have, which are driver salaries, salaries of the 3 highest paid staff members, so non-drivers. Generally, this would be the team principal, who is the one who runs the entire team, and then probably a lead engineer or technology officer or people along those lines. Also not included is marketing, which is a huge, huge expense, and travel. Transportation for the cars and parts and stuff has to be in that 140 million-ish, but travel for a team is not included in that. So that can double or easily triple the cost, up to over $500 million a year for some teams. There are essentially 2 types of teams in the field. There are works teams that manufacture engines, fully develop their cars, like Ferrari and Mercedes. And then there are customer teams that purchase a chassis and engines from the works teams that they then further develop. A couple examples of customer teams right now are Williams, which is a customer of Mercedes, and Haas, which sources parts from Ferrari. There are 10 teams on the grid, each with 2 cars and 2 drivers. It's fairly common for teams to have a number 1 driver and a number 2 driver. The number 1 is typically whoever is more senior or expected to be more competitive. Occasionally during the race, a second driver will be given team orders to let his teammate through, especially if it looks like it'll be advantageous for the team. So on race weekends, you'll typically see the drivers, a few people on the pit wall, including the principal, which I mentioned, and a handful of crew changing tires. But each team directly employs anywhere from several hundred people to over 1,000. That's a lot of people behind the scenes, and that's why that $145 million adds up so fast, is all those salaries. Now let's take a huge overview of the way the season breaks down. For the 2024 season, there will be 24 races spanning the globe on every continent other than Africa and Antarctica. The schedule in general tries to keep consecutive races in the same part of the world to ease the logistics of travel and transporting all the cars and equipment and people needed, but it's still super impressive to move all that stuff even within a few hundred miles over the course of 4 days or so. I highly recommend looking more into the logistics of Formula One if you get a chance. Typically, the season will start in February or March and ends in November, but there's also a month-long summer break roughly in the middle. At the end of the season, or sometimes before, like last season when Max just destroyed everyone, a driver's champion and a constructor's champion will be awarded at the end of the season for those with the most points. For a team to win a championship, they need to keep improving throughout the year, and teams typically have 2 or 3 major upgrade packages alongside minor adjustments that they make every week. It's kind of the rule that if you don't improve throughout the season or your upgrades don't have the expected outcomes, you start falling behind. Teams like Aston Martin last year started off really strong and then let things kind of slip away in their upgrades a little bit, and so they started to drop down the order. Before we talk about the race weekend, if you've made it this far, please like this video, subscribe to the channel. Your support would be greatly appreciated. All right, now let's get into race weekend. A typical race weekend consists of 3 practices, a qualifier, and the race. Let's break down each one on their own. So during practice runs, teams and drivers work to set up their car and make adjustments specifically for that track. They drive with different amounts of fuel to see the pace of the car and how it might react in different situations, how it affects the tires. Speaking of tires, we're going to have to take a quick detour as it's one of the most important pieces in strategizing for the weekend. Now, Pirelli, who manufactures the tires used in Formula One, has 5 different compounds of tires that are used throughout the season, but any given weekend, only 3 of those are allowed. So typically there is a C1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then say last weekend, they had the 3 hardest tires, 3, 4, and 5. They were the only ones available. And now the 3 is considered the soft tire for that weekend, the 4 is the medium, the 5 is the hard. Watch a little bit and you'll get it. It's a little confusing to explain, but when you see it in practice, it should start to make sense. So of those 3 compounds, the softer tires will heat up faster and move the car faster in general, but they also tend to wear out more quickly. Hard tires last a lot longer, but tend to be slower, take longer to get up to optimum levels than medium tires, which are, well, medium, are kind of in the middle. Each car is allowed 13 sets of dry tires per race weekend. There are also wet and intermediate, but we're not going to touch on that today. So teams will typically use soft tires in practice to get an idea of their single lap pace, and then mediums and hards or both to kind of judge tire degradation and run with heavier fuel loads. After the practice sessions, we get into action with qualifying, which essentially works like this. There are 3 rounds of qualifying. In the first round, all 20 cars compete for the best single lap time. Bottom 5 are cut and will be placed on the grid where they finish. Then in the second qualifier, the remaining 15 cars will compete again. 5 more cars are dropped, and then the third round is run with the final 10 cars. Where you finish is where you start on race day. And it doesn't matter if, like last weekend, Leclerc had the fastest time of anybody, but it was in the second qualifier, not in the third qualifier, which is where the top 10 drivers were placed. So he ended up starting second behind Max. Teams stagger their laps during qualifying and typically do an out lap, which is when you come out from the pit and you go around once, start to warm up your tires, and then a hot lap, which is the lap where they're trying to get the time down. And then they return back to the garage, change the tires, and repeat the process. As long as you're on track and you have started a new lap, it's okay if the clock runs out, you're allowed to finish that lap. So as you're watching on TV, you're going to see a lot of, this person's on pole, this person's here, and then as soon as maybe somebody in 15th or so finishes, maybe they move up to provisional pole, is what it's called before all the times are verified. So it kind of will change, and it's a little bit confusing to some people, but basically, as you go throughout the qualifying session, the track also gets better as far as race quality in general. There are other things that happen, but there are also a few things to watch out for. You want to get out early in case there's a yellow or red flag that keeps you from actually getting a qualifying time. So you'll see teams go out early for the most part, get a lap in that's decent, but teams that wait, they save tires for when the track is better, but they're also taking that risk of not being able to get a time in that counts. Before we get to talking about the race day itself, there are a few weekends that are a little bit different, and I just want to touch on those. Those are sprint weekends. They've changed a little bit how they work every year. So if you're watching this in 2025, it may have changed. If you're watching this in 2024, I may have gotten it a little bit wrong and kind of been based on last year's stuff. But essentially what happens is there are fewer practices for the teams. So a standard weekend is Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Some races are Thursday, Friday, Saturday, set up for the weekends. But we're going to talk about Friday, Saturday, Sunday right now. So Friday, the first day, would be a practice. And then you're qualifying for the sprint race. And on Saturday, you'll do the sprint race. So the sprint race is essentially a live race that is 1/3 the length of the regular race. It's supposed to create more excitement for the weekend for fans. It is a big drain on the drivers and teams, obviously. But last year in Austin was a sprint weekend, and I enjoyed the extra action being a fan. So this year on Saturday, the sprint race is in the morning, and then qualifying for the full race is in the evening. Last year, qualifiers were on Friday, then everything for the sprint was on Saturday, and then the race was Sunday. But it's changed. The only thing that's still the same is the race is still on Sunday, or the third day of the weekend. So on race day, cars start on the grid, lined up based on where they finished in the qualifier. At the official start time, usually on TV, you'll actually see the clock tick, and the cars are released to do a warm-up lap. It's called a formation lap, basically to warm up the tires. And by the time everyone gets back, then the race starts. But there's a little gamesmanship going on. So if you are the last car, you can kind of take your time a little bit. And what happens is the cars in front of you have been sitting longer, and the tires start to cool down again already. So, that's just one of those things that's part of racing right now. So anyway, drivers are back on the grid, and then you see 5 lights light up, and then they all go out, and away we go. So a lot of things happen during the race that will determine who will win, from the launch at the start and the first corner madness to tire degradation, timing for pit stops. I'll try to hit on as many of these as I can as quickly as possible. Races themselves run for a certain distance, so the number of laps on any given track will be different. There's also a maximum time limit that typically doesn't come into play unless there's a major incident or an ongoing inclement weather situation. Now, each car is required to use 2 different compounds of tires during the race, either soft and medium, medium and hard, soft and hard, which means they at least have to take 1 pit stop. Most races will require 2 or 3 stops depending on race strategy, and the time a pit stop costs a driver depends on a lot of factors, including the length of the pit lane, how quick the team can swap the tires, if there's any other work needed, and other traffic in the pit lane. So a team of about 20, including the driver, is able to lift the car, replace 4 tires, get the car back down, and get out of the way in about 3 seconds. The record, I believe off the top of my head, is 1.7 seconds. Try and picture that. It's probably one of the most impressive things to me about Formula One, and a slow stop can kill you when the difference in finishing times between cars can be within a couple seconds. Another thing that can slow down the pit stop are penalties. Typically we see 5-second variety put in place for things like going outside of track limits, causing an avoidable accident, or taking a place unfairly, also speeding in the pit lane, or improperly taking a previous penalty. That one hurts. To serve a penalty, car needs to be stopped for 5 full seconds without anyone touching it. If you don't pit once you've been served a penalty, the time is just added on at the end of the race. One strategy that teams employ to gain an advantage during a race is the timing of their pit stops. You can undercut a competitor, meaning that you pit first to get on fresher tires and make the other team react or respond to you. Or you can overcut, which means that you stay out longer on worn tires to have fresher ones at the end of the race. Whether one or the other will work depends on how their tires are degrading on the car compared to the competition. And a lot of things can determine how fast a tire breaks down, from the compound of the tire to the way a driver drives the car to the track temperature and the specifics of the car itself. Similarly, one team can opt for a 2-stop strategy with harder compound tires, while another might look at a 3-stop strategy with softer compounds, depending on how they think the race will go. This strategy always changes during a race though, and the whole team needs to be ready to adjust on the fly. Passing is one of the most exciting things for fans on the track. Drivers can wait for the car in front to make a mistake, or they can aggressively try to pass with late braking, or they can utilize slipstreams and DRS to their advantage. I won't get into racecraft in this video, but I do want to explain DRS, or the drag reduction system. Essentially, a driver can open up their rear wing to reduce drag, gain speed, and pass a rival. On a racetrack, there are detection zones that measure the distance in time from you to the car in front of you. If you're within a second, then you can use DRS when you're in the DRS zone, which is typically a long straight. A car can gain around 15 kilometers an hour by utilizing DRS, and that's on top of any slipstream advantage that they may have to get them started catching up. At the end of the race, points for drivers and constructors are awarded based on this table. Additionally, 1 point is awarded to the driver with the fastest lap as long as they were in the top 10. Drivers from 11 to 20 get no points. Additionally, a fan-voted driver of the day is named, though it doesn't offer any extra points in the championship. And then, as we mentioned the sprint races before, there are added points for sprint weekends. I will put those up here as well. As you can see, a lot goes into a race, a weekend, a car, and a season. We haven't even touched on things like wet weather conditions, individual tracks, the massive effort it takes for someone to get into Formula One, whether it's as a driver, an owner, or an engineer. We have not talked about how to drive fast or the toll a race takes on a driver. And most importantly, we haven't brought up how to watch a race yourself in person. Last year, I went to my first race and it was fantastic. I thought that maybe being there you only see the course for a little bit, and it was going to be not as good as watching on TV, but it was amazing. And the weekend itself was extra. I'm going to bring that video to you guys at some point. But for now, we've barely grazed the surface of the topics that we did bring up. I'm hoping to get more in depth on these topics in future videos. If you have a specific topic or a question you'd like covered, leave it in the comments below and I'll try to make it happen. Until then, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something today and that this video helps you understand and enjoy Formula One. Cheers.